nice shoes. The security guy that does the security.
You're like,
No.
where's the doggy?
Like, so my backpack was booked. The backpack was booked. Back in, and I was like, oh, good. And so they pulled him out, and he pulled me back down. They're like, security really thought that was sketchy.
Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. It was good to see, what, 5 of you, 6 of you yesterday? I hope the rest of you. They are free today. Immune. Oh, I don't remember, but I'll think about it. But you're at least free today, my friend. A lot of you never watched the first makeup. I was actually surprised. It was a freebie, and a lot of you never emailed me, so you're absent. You did at home, you could watch it, but anyway.
So notes on the.
If you told me about it, then you're in. But yeah, to email me about it. If you check your attendance, but if you didn't email me, then you didn't watch it. Okay. All right. Well, make sure you watch the next one because it's freebie. Yeah. I did, but if I didn't, check your email. I check your attendance on the app. Yeah, but a lot of you didn't email me and didn't do anything. Yeah.
It just says excuse.
Excuse, yeah.
Okay.
That's what it says. Excuse is not absent. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Anything in your minds? Yeah, Diana.
On the Massacre case,
Yes, ma'am.
the reporter comparing opinion, when he said that even if the military order is deemed unconstitutional, and to fall back on the interstate commerce, is that something
To fall back on the what?
interstate commerce? Or is that
I wouldn't worry about it.
okay?
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me. I'm not sure, but I think you're probably okay. Yeah, Dusty.
You have 7 days to watch yesterday's video, right?
From yesterday. Yeah.
So if we email you on Saturday,
Oh, you vague. Some of you did it like 11:54 on the 1 week deadline. I forgot who it was, but someone emailed. I actually stayed till midnight tonight waiting for the email. And at 11:54, the email came in.
so
That you-
by the 30th means the third on the 30th is acceptable.
Yeah, I didn't specify a time, so I'll say at the 30th by the end of the day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Reason why mine shows absences last week on the 17th.
You come talk to me after. Yeah.
Oh, it has dates.
Yeah.
So if you watch the live stream, they still need to send you.
You have to tell me. I don't know if you watched it. I had no idea.
Hold on. I could argue that for
Trolling the comment thread is not an adequate attendance. The comment thread. These guys are commenting each other. I see the comments popping up my phone while you do them today. They pop up my phone. But anyway, any actual substantive comments? You will all be lawyers. And let me just make a point though. One of those important. Okay, what's the most important thing about being a lawyer? What most important rule?
attention to detail.
No. Get paid. Who said it? Because if you don't get paid, you're out of a job. And the way you get paid as a lawyer is by keeping track of your time very precisely. And you have to send your client a record of all the hours you bill, usually in 6-minute increments. And you have to do it on a fairly timely basis. If you don't do it on a timely basis, you don't get paid. So this is such a trivial thing in my mind, the attendance thing, and it frustrates us to no end. You will have electronic billing software that is much more complicated than this silly app that you're going to have to deal with. Okay? All right. Yes. I know. I've been futzing with the settings. How was it yesterday? How was it yesterday? Okay. Better than last time. Okay. Yeah, it's tricky. I like having the wireless mic that lets me walk around, and so if I'm in the back of the room versus having something up front. So trade-offs. We'll see how this one is. Okay. But was there any weird feedback yesterday or no?
For a while, it said it wasn't on because you were watching it live, but then I basically just stopped watching it and then came back and watched it later.
The audio was okay?
Yeah, it was,
My voice was loud and clear?
yeah, it was not working while it was live. It was fine.
I They'll give me the shrug emoticon, which people put in a comment thread to signify their attendance. All right. I do the best I can. All right. Let's do a question. All right, let's do a question, please. And the question for you is this. The Constitution authorizes the president to remove principal officers. Not at all a timely topic. I mean, it's just, in no way timely. Am I doing the right class? Is it loading for you? Some of you got it. All right, let's. Wow, people still not voting. I'll give it a few more seconds. Put your vote. Loading. That.
It's not loading, but it's saying.
Close the app and try coming back in. I've had difficulties with this iReef thing. The problem concerns the too many people hitting at the exact same time, and when that happens, sometimes it locks people out, which is unfortunate. All right. Okay. Where was I? Who's next? Are you pointing at her?
It is.
And then are you next, or is he next?
It goes that way. I went last time.
Okay, that he remembers. Okay. Sahar. Sahar, let me ask you a question, okay? What's a principal officer? Let's start clause by clause, right? What's a principal officer? How do you know this? Where are you getting this from? Okay, so we have the Constitution. It's in Article 2, Section 2, right? It's long. But it says, I'll read it to you. The President shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and councils, being independent counsel today, judges, the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not hereinafter provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the President alone, or in the courts of law, or in the heads of department. All right, so I just read that entire passage for you. Does the word principal officer appear anywhere in that passage? No, it doesn't. What word does appear? Not principal, but one at a time. There's nothing of principal officers. What kind of officers are referenced? Keep reading. What else? Inferior officers. So what's an inferior officer then? Principal. And herein lies the dilemma, right? The premise of my question, right, can the president remove a principal officer, according to the Constitution, is somewhat of a misleading question. Because the Constitution says nothing about principal officers. It only references inferior officers. Now, Sahar gave me a decent starting point, right? She said, well, principal officer is a judge, an ambassador, public minister, and I think she's right about that, right? The word principal has come into our, constitutional vocabulary over the years, but it's not in the Constitution. And simply stated, a principal officer is one who's not inferior. And an inferior officer is one who's not principal, which tells you absolutely nothing. So there's been a huge debate for 200 years about drawing a line between a principal and an inferior officer. Morrison tries poorly at that effort. They don't really give you much to go on. But Morrison tries to give you something about that line. Okay? So the first part of my question is, go back up to it. I've got my own question. It was, does the Constitution authorize the president to remove principal officers? So we don't really know what a principal officer is. It means that someone of some stature above an inferior officer. Sam? Does the Constitution give the president the power to remove any officer? Okay. So back to the Appointments Clause, right? And the president can't do it by himself. He can nominate. And if the Senate provides its advice and consent, that means that 51% vote, right, more than a simple majority. If the Senate gives its advice and consent, then the person's confirmed. But Sam, does it say anything about how a person's supposed to leave office? All right. So, I mean, there's a couple ways we could do this. You can imagine the Senate says, well, appoint someone for a judgeship. In that case, the person basically serves for life unless they're removed. And maybe Congress creates an office that says, this is a 5-year position, and you'll serve here for 5 years. Okay? Or the position says, you'll serve here indefinitely. Does that mean the person, sorry.
Oh, Monique.
Monique, thank you, Monique. Does that mean the person can serve forever? From president to president? Does that mean that, President Trump has to accept all President Obama's nominees and President Bush has to accept all President Clinton's nominees? Just have to stay in office forever? Then what gives the president the power to get rid of people? I mean, they can always resign, right? If a person wants to resign, they can resign. Well, something in their throat. But short of resigning, what gives the president the power to fire someone?
It talks about it in the case. He just takes on that. It wasn't enumerated.
Not enumerated.
But
where does it come from, Monique?
because I guess it's local tradition. Because
Well, there's text, right? Where does this come from? Right? Where? Well, Monique, let me ask this question a little bit differently, right? Imagine, if you will, that one president appoints someone to be the Secretary of War, for example, and this secretary has a certain vision of what he wants to do. A new president comes in, and the new president wants to go a different direction. But the old secretary is saying, nope, I'm going to keep doing what I want to do.
well, he can't fire at will. It has to be for a good cause.
But let's just say he has good cause, right? Let's just say that the Secretary of War is disobeying orders, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that a problem, Moniqua, when a Secretary of War is not following the president's instruction? Why is that problematic?
Because it says that he shall take care of the law executed.
She got it. Say it again one more time, please.
He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed and shall commission all the officers of the United States.
Perfect answer. Thank you so much. The president's elected for a reason, right? He's elected for a reason. He has an obligation, as Moniqua said, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And the meaning of this clause remains very much in doubt. But one aspect of it people tend to agree on is the president's a supervisor, right? The president can't do everything by himself. He has a Secretary of the Treasury to handle financial matters. He has a Secretary of the Navy to handle the Navy. A Secretary of War to handle war efforts. Secretary of State to handle foreign affairs, right? There are all these departments and agencies and things in the executive branch because the president can't do it all by himself, right? He can't do it all by himself, right? He can't. So instead, other people, his subordinates, do stuff. but they do so at the direction of the president. So, for example, President number 1 might have a certain vision of what he wants to do, and President 2 has another vision. If the president says, Secretary of whatever, do X, and he's like, screw off, I'm not going to do it. Not going to do it. Can the president then supervise that the law is being faithfully executed? And the general answer is he can't, right? If people within his own administration are actively disobeying and thwarting his efforts, the president's obligation to hear the law is faithfully executed is being violated. Sorry, timely topic, right? But that's the general argument, right? If the president can't control his own administration, then he's not doing his own oath of office. That is where the basis of the power to remove comes from, right? There's no textual grant of removal power. It doesn't exist. You can look in vain, it's not there. But it's understood to derive from the president's responsibility to take care the laws are faithfully executed. Now, generally, and not to be timely, when the president says, I'd like your resignation, people resign. Apparently doesn't happen anymore. So when it doesn't happen, yeah.
So, what you're saying,
I don't know what I'm saying. No, please, ask your question.
but, so you're saying fire, right? I understand contextually what you're saying, but generally, when a new administration comes in, when a new president comes in, certain positions, politically appointed positions like heads of agencies, they, there's a process by which they offer, like a, I think they call it pink slip or something. So you are.
They offer what?
You offer, it's kind of like, they call it pink slip, I forget what it's really called, but,
Yeah.
you know, the heads of the agencies turn in essentially their resignation,
On the
and
day.
either the president accepts it or not.
Yeah.
If he accepts it, then
They walk away.
obviously,
Yeah.
well, so you're saying that he fires and all that kind of stuff, but there's a process by which it automatically.
What if they don't hand the
automatically
resignation
turns.
in?
Well, it's understood in certain positions.
It's
that you
understood,
turn
but what if
in-
you don't resign?
What?
But no.
It's understood in certain positions that you turn in that letter, and if the president accepts it. So what do you mean when you don't?
Well,
When
it's
you
happened in
get the
American
job,
history where they don't do it.
In 2 8, right now, today.
Not just today, 1860s too. It's,
Well, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking right now. I'm saying right now, there's a process where you turn in your.
it would be lovely if people just resign, but it doesn't always happen. Let me tell you some history. Can I tell you some history?
Sure.
Let's do some history. Well, I'll get to actually Kenisha's question in a couple minutes. Let's do some history, all right? There's no express power to remove. But let me ask you a second question. Cassandra, let me ask you this question. We know that you need Senate consent to appoint someone, right? You need the Senate's consent to appoint someone. Do you need the Senate's consent to fire someone?
I would say no.
Does the Constitution say anything about how the Senate has to proceed? Do we have an answer? Can Congress pass a statute, Sandra, saying that if the president wants to fire the secretary of whatever, he's got to get the Senate's permission first? Can the Senate enact such a law?
I would say no.
So this is a harder question. I see you're struggling a bit, right? So in the very early years of the Republic, right? I'm talking like 1790, right? Very early on, the Washington administration, right? There was a great debate, a great decision, right? It was called, 1789, it's off by a year. It was called the Decision of 1789. That's what it's called. I'm sorry?
That'll be memorable.
Yeah.
Decision of 1789.
So this is this is one of the very first Congress, one of the first decisions. And the House considered the question, right? Can they make the president seek the consent of the Senate to remove someone, right? Can the House require the president go seek senatorial consent before firing someone, right? The House of Representatives and the Senate divided on this one, right? They didn't quite agree on whether you could require this limitation on the president's removal power. Okay? The House of Representatives said, no, you cannot make the president get permission fire someone. The Senate tied. There was a tie in the Senate. And what happens when there's a tie in the Senate? The vice president breaks the vote. And that was actually John Adams, who was President Washington's vice president. So in the very early years of a republic, there was something of an informal decision called the Decision of 1789, in which Congress suggested that you shouldn't put this restraint on the president. But that wasn't, a judicial decision. It was a decision of Congress, which is nothing wrong with that, right? The executive branch, legislative branch, they can make decisions on the Constitution. Okay? But fast forward, this is getting to Kenesha's question, the Civil War. I think we already discussed this a little bit, but after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president, became the president. Now, Lincoln was a Republican, Johnson was a Democrat. Lincoln was very much in favor of Reconstruction in the South, to bring the South back under the Constitution. And Johnson, from Tennessee, did not favor Reconstruction very much. When Johnson came into office, he inherited Lincoln's cabinet, right? All the people in the Lincoln administration did not turn in their pink slips. In fact, one of them, a guy named Stanton, who is Lincoln's Secretary of War, was strongly opposed to Johnson's agenda. He did not resign. Congress had enacted a law called the Tenure of Office Act. It's a very important piece of legislation. The Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act requires the Senate to vote if the president wants to fire the Secretary of War. Okay, let's say that one more time. Under the Tenure of Office Act, if Johnson, the president, wants to fire the Secretary of War, he needs the Senate's consent. And the Senate, which was controlled by the Republicans, was not going to give that consent. So you had a standoff, right? This is actually remarkable history. Johnson ordered Stanton, "You're fired." Stanton said, "No." What? He says, the statute, the Tenure of Office Act, says you can't fire me unless you get the Senate's consent first. Your order of firing is not allowed. And according to the history, Stanton basically locked himself up in the room and said, "Come and get me." So to Kenesha's question, what ought to happen is you hand in your pink slip. What sometimes happens in history is they said, not going to happen. Eventually, Stanton stood down, he left office, and he left. But that didn't end the question. The United States Congress tried to impeach President Andrew Johnson. There were a lot of charges there, but the most important charge concerned this incident. And they alleged that by firing Stanton without getting the Senate's consent, he violated the Tenure of Office Act. They basically charged him with violating the statute, that he did not seek consent before terminating the Secretary of War. He was impeached in the House. That's the first step. And the second step, he had a Senate trial. And this is famous. If you ever read Profiles in Courage, John Kennedy back in high school maybe, there was one vote short of removal in the Senate. They fell one vote shy of removing the President of the United States, which was stunning. They came within a vote of knocking the President out. But the biggest debate was, did President Johnson violate the Tenure of Office Act? Which raises a question. Johnson said, the Tenure of Office Act, not constitutional. Johnson said, you can't put this constraint. You can't shackle my removal power. He cited the decision of 1789 that is, saying, this decision suggests that you can't constrain the president's removal power for my Secretary of War. If I have the duty to faithfully execute the laws, and this jerk Stanton's locking himself up in his room, I can't do my job. I was elected, well, he was, I guess, elevated as president, but he became president, and this guy who's not president cannot stop me. But again, we don't have a judicial ruling. We have a vote on an impeachment trial. But an impeachment is a trial, and I do consider it as a judicial function. I think we have to consider it. So we don't have a resolution of the question. Right? We still don't know, can Congress impose limitations on the president's removal power. So then fast forward to a case called United States versus Myers. Okay? United States versus Myers. 1923, I might be off by the year. I'm sorry, Myers versus United States. I'm sorry, I flipped it. 26. It's just off. 1926. Okay. This case involves something a lot more boring. It involved a postmaster general, right? A postmaster. Not the general, he was a postmaster. He was appointed by one president, and then Congress put a limitation saying he can't be fired without the Senate's consent. Another president comes into office and says, you're fired. Then the postmaster tries to sue for his salary, saying, hey, you know, I want my salary, you can't fire me, I'm still validly the postmaster. And you have an opinion by Chief Justice Taft, William Howard Taft, who was formerly the president, and after serving as president, he became the Chief Justice. By the way, you ever see pictures? The guy was huge, right? He was huge. This is actually a true story. He once broke a horse's ankles.
Aww.
And then, I'm serious, and then they sent, I think it was either a camel or something, they sent him a camel to ride instead. The guy was huge. He had a spread, I clerked at this, what?
That was here in Texas.
Was it?
In Taft, there's a little town called Taft.
Oh, that's right? You seen this?
I heard it on NPR.
She's right. Listen to NPR, just not when I'm on it, right? But listen to. I'm sorry if I ruined your commute. So yeah, she's right. And apparently they sent him a camel or something after the fact. Like, he also had this custom-made chair. I clerked at the Sixth Circuit where he was a judge, and this chair was like this. Like the circumference was like humongous. You feel like those like when you're like a Santa Claus chair, like just a huge chair. Anyway, so Taft was the opinion, but he had a unique perspective. He was a president, and they became the Chief Justice. And he said without question that Andrew Johnson was correct. And he said that the decision of 1759 was correct. He said that the Tenure in Office Act was unconstitutional. That the Tenure of Office Act was not constitutional, that the removal power belongs to the president and Congress can't control it. And I don't assign Myers anymore. I used to. It's really long and hard to read. So take my summary for its worth, but you have to know it exists. It's referenced in Myers as well. So all's well and good, right? Myers was 1926. It holds that the president has basically unlimited removal power over his principal officers, and everything looks great. But then we get to the New Deal, right? In 1935. We get to the New Deal in 1935. And if you recall, before 37, the court would rule against Roosevelt on a fairly consistent basis. We had Schechter Poultry, we have Panama Refining. We have a number of cases where the court rules against the president before 36, 37. And Humphrey's executor is one of these cases. So let me take a step back. We often think of Washington, D.C. as a bunch of departments and agencies. Anyone work for the federal government here? Anyone? Where do you work? Know which agency? Yeah, one of those. Okay, fine. Well, anyone else? So people don't quite appreciate this, but there are different types of federal agencies, right? There are some agencies which are headed by a single person. For example, the State Department is headed by the Secretary of State. The Department of Defense is headed by the Secretary of Defense. The Treasury Department is headed by the Secretary of the Treasury, right? These are agencies that are considered within the executive branch solely. Then you have these other agencies that are kind of weird. They usually end with either commission or board. So for example, we have the National Labor Relations Board from our reading today, which has 5 members. That was a very important part of your reading for today. You have the Federal Trade Commission, which is 5 members. You have the Federal Communications Commission, 5 members. You have the Securities and Exchange Commission, 5 members. Now, why is that important? Why am I giving you this facts? These are not headed by a single person. They have 5-member boards. Usually it's 3 members of the same party as the president, right? And then 2 members of the other political party. Why did Congress create agencies like this? They were designed to be, quote, independent. And I'm putting scare quotes here very casually. They're meant to be insulated from politics a little bit. Why? For certain sensitive areas, the economy, financial market, communication, Congress doesn't want it wholly within the president's control. So you have these 5-member boards, and they vote. 3-2 and everything, usually, but they can vote. But they do something else. They provide protection. They say the president can't fire these people, these commissioners, these board members. They can't be fired at will. And at will means you're fired, I don't think of a reason. Just get out of here, you're fired. The statute for these agencies says you can't fire them at will. Instead, you can only fire them what's called for cause. For cause, which generally means they screwed up. They broke a rule, they broke the law, they engaged in some bad act. In other words, you can't just fire them because you disagree with them. Or maybe you can. I think this issue is actually still being litigated. The scope of what for cause has never really been defined. Right? The courts have never really decided what it means for cause. I would read it pretty strictly, but it's never been decided. The question is, can Congress do this? Can Congress limit the president's removal power of these members of these commissions, these agencies, these independent agencies? Okay, so we had Myers in 1926 saying the president can fire whoever he wants, doesn't matter. Then we get to the New Deal. And the court rules against President Roosevelt. Again. And I think you have to understand this decision as a product of the time which was decided. It's probably not correct. The court was mostly doing it in a fit of spite against Roosevelt, but it became the law for some time. Now, what the court held is that for members of these independent agencies, Congress can provide protection for them. Congress can limit the president's removal power. That's what happened in Humphrey's executor. President Roosevelt told a commissioner, I think it was the Federal Trade Commission, I think it's a good time you step down now. Time to go. Didn't give a reason, said, you should go now. The guy says, I'm not going. Okay, fired. He actually sued to collect his salary, and he died. That's why it's called Humphrey's executor. He died, so the executor of his state was actually trying to collect the money. Random story, but I once mentioned this in class. It's just creepy. And I said, I wonder how the guy died. And some random person on YouTube who listens to my lectures got his death certificate. Because I made a joke like, wow, I wonder if Roosevelt offed him. Right? Now, I was mostly joking, but YouTube. So someone actually sent me a copy of his death certificate. He had some sort of coronary problem, so he had a heart attack. So it looked legit. Or that's what they want you to think. That's what they want you to think, right? These new dealers, right? But he died, and the Supreme Court held that when you have these independent agencies, Congress can provide protections. Why? He said, well, these independent agencies are not strictly executive officials. They're a blend. These agencies have some legislative capacity, and they have some judicial capacity. What does that mean? Agencies make regulations. What's regulation? Well, it's not like a law. It's not like a statute. But it looks like a law, as a force of law. So they're kind of legislative. And these agencies also have fake courts that are called judges, administrative law judges, right? And they handle disputes, and they even wear robes sometimes. They're not real judges. But because these agencies have a mix of legislative and executive and judicial functions, they're not only within the executive's control, therefore Congress can protect them. Now, if you think that line between executive and legislative and judicial is mushy, don't worry about it. It's not good law anymore. Because basically Morris versus Olson gets rid of that line. We'll do Morrison a little bit later in class. But Humphreys laid down a line saying that Congress can insulate, can protect certain independent agency officials from removal and require a for-cause standard. That they can only be fired for cause. I realize I'm lecturing a lot, but there's a lot I want to get through today, so I'll keep going. So with me so far? Yeah.
There was something about quasi.
Yeah, I didn't want to say the word. You're going to make me do it. Yeah. So what the court said in Humphreys, what the court said in Humphreys' executor is that they're quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial. Trisha, what the heck does that mean? That's why you asked, right?
Yeah.
legislative is the thing to make the regulations, but not the laws, and judicial is, and they're the ones that are determining it too.
It's a little bit worse than that. So what these agencies actually do is they're basically like mini governments unto themselves. We all know that all legislative powers are vested in Congress, except they're not. Agencies issue what are called regulations, which have the force of law, but they're never voted on by Congress and they're not signed by the president. So they basically exercise mini legislative authorities. Congress says, we give the EPA the power to issue regulations to make reasonable and clean air, or something like that. And they issue billions of pages of regulations saying what clean air means. Okay. So that's quasi-legislative.
So you said that, okay, so for the Humphreys case, that gave Congress could put some limitations for the agencies. Then for the Myers is
for non-independent agencies.
non-independent.
Yeah, for regular principal officers.
So just principal.
I didn't get there yet, but
Because you said later on, whomever he wants to be.
I'm sorry? Well, so let me summarize. Janice and me asking two questions. Myers didn't really discuss independent agencies because Cass said you can fire whoever you want. It was discussing a postmaster who, is not particularly important, but it's important back then. Okay? Humphrey's executors only concern independent agencies because they have this quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial functions. These boards actually make adjudications. They hear cases and they make decisions in somewhat of a judicial fashion. They're not real judges. They sometimes wear robes. They pretend to be. It's like Halloween, but they act like judges. There was a case last year with Chief Justice Roberts where one of the lawyers referred to someone in this agency as a judge, and Roberts like, they're not judges, and he had this scorn in his voice. He's right. They're not judges. Your Honor, yeah, whatever. But, so Humphreys drew this line saying, they're these quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial, so they're not really executive. That way the president can't have full removal power. In other words, the president's removal power is limited because they have these other functions which Congress wants to protect. Tricia, does that make a little sense? Don't get too hung up on this line between quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial versus purely executive, right? The postmaster, for example, is purely executive. That's how they describe it. It was a purely executive official. That line does not exist after Morrison. Rehnquist basically just threw that one in the trash and did it very quietly. What's placed in the dustbin of history or something? Oh, such a good opinion. Gets better every year when I teach it. Okay. All right, so everyone with me so far up to New Deal. Okay, so after New Deal, we have a situation where for purely executive officials, like a postmaster, the president can fire away. For these quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial officials, Congress can provide protections of removal. But this doesn't apply to low-level civil servants, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, right? When the Constitution says if you're an inferior officer, so if you're like a random federal employee, right, you can have civil service protections, right? I'm only talking about principal officers who are of a certain level. So the inferior people, I don't mean that in the sense that they're not important, but just constitutionally they're not protected in the same way. Okay. So let's fast forward, right? So after the New Deal, Congress can create statutes that provide protection for removal from office. Okay. So now we go forward a little bit. Is anyone around during Watergate? I don't know how ages of people. I don't want to ask. What? I don't know. I wasn't live. I don't know. I was also looking around. I wasn't live. Anyway, I was not born. But okay, so it's fine. Because I've had older students tell me I'm wrong about stuff. Like, okay, I'll try and be as accurate as I can. So we fast forward to the Nixon era. Now the video I think does a good job explaining the chronology. It's a chronology most people don't actually appreciate. But while President Nixon was running for re-election, there was a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, which was the site of the Democratic Committee. Why they broke in is still not exactly known. What they were looking for, not 100% sure, but they broke in. It's not clear that Nixon knew about the break-in. He probably didn't. But Nixon did become aware of the break-in for sure. This much we know. And he discussed ways of covering it up. And this involved basically bribing people to keep quiet, just to grossly condense a long history. How do we know about these things? Nixon was paranoid. He had a tape recording system built into the Oval Office, and it was set on auto record. So whenever it would sense people talking, it would start rolling the tapes, right? You know, people recording stuff in the White House. Now they have iPhones. You know, back in the day, they actually had you know, these huge cassette tapes. Okay, so why is this important? The Department of Justice appointed what's called a special counsel. A special counsel. Now, what is a special counsel? At the time, a special counsel was someone who worked within the executive branch, right? It was not independent in any meaningful sense. It was appointed by the Attorney General to investigate something, a sensitive issue, in this case, Watergate. Now, the reason why this is important is at the time the Attorney General was a guy named Elliot Richardson. And Elliot Richardson, during his Senate confirmation, had made a promise. He promised the Senate, I will appoint a special counsel. Right? Again, it's not the president appointing the counsel, it's the Attorney General. The Attorney General reports to the president, and in theory, at least, if the president says the AG fired the special counsel, he does it. Well, didn't quite go that way. So everything was chugging along until Archibald Cox learns of these secret tape recording systems in the White House. And Cox issues a subpoena to the president to produce the tapes. It's called a subpoena ducis tecum. You'll probably see this word next year or so. Here, let me spell it for you. That's all I want to do. The word is a subpoena ducis tecum. If this ever comes up, you'll remember it. It's a subpoena, an order to produce certain documents to the court, as opposed to a subpoena ad testificandum, which is a subpoena to testify. It sounds worse than it is. What'd you think I said? Oh, get your minds out of the gutter. If we weren't watching Fox today at 6. Oh boy, we're in for a week. I'm gonna be in DC on Thursday, which is gonna be fun.
Wow.
Not for this. No, not for this. No, God. I'll be somewhere else. I'm doing actually a lecture on civility. Lord help us, right? So Cox issued a subpoena to President Nixon to provide these tapes, and Nixon flips out. Dude flips out, and this all went down on a Saturday night. It's always on a Saturday night. So Nixon, by the way, they knew this was coming, right? It's often portrayed in the media like, you know, there was a surprise thing. Everyone knew it was going to happen, right? Once Cox issued a subpoena, they knew they were getting fired, right? When they get in that blacklist, even go to the White House, they know they're getting fired unless they're not. But in this case, they actually got an order. And Nixon ordered the Attorney General to fire Cox. Now, under the regulation at the time, Nixon couldn't fire Cox by himself. I question whether that was correct. I think he probably could have, but he didn't need to, right? This was a case where Cox wasn't going to resign, right? Nixon say, hey, Mr. Cox, can you resign? No pink slip. So Nixon goes to Cox, fire him. And Cox says, I'm not going to do it. So then Cox resigns. Again, Nixon did not fire Cox. It's this common myth. It didn't happen. So at that point, you have a chain of command in the Department of Justice. And the number 2 guy, the Assistant Attorney General. I'm sorry, the Deputy Attorney General, the DAG. By the way, Rod Rosenstein is the DAG, the Deputy Attorney General. So timely. And Nixon says to the DAG, the Deputy Attorney General, Ruckelshaus, fire Cox. And Ruckelshaus says, not going to do it, I'm going to resign. There's a big debate whether Nixon fired Ruckelshaus or resigned. Ruckelshaus insists he resigned. I think he's probably right about that, but whatever, it doesn't really matter. And then the third in line is the Solicitor General, a guy by the name of Noel Francis. No, I'm sorry. His name was Robert Bork. Our current SG is Bill Francisco. I'll explain why in a minute why I'm giving these sort of jokes. But the SG was then Robert Bork. And Bork knew this was coming. Bork understood this was coming. And he was ready to fire Cox. And the reason why is he thought the president had that power. Ruckelshaus and Richardson had promised the Senate they would support the special counsel. They made a promise. And Bork didn't make that promise to the Senate, so he fired Cox. This incident is called the Saturday Evening Massacre. Sounds very gruesome, right? Even though Nixon didn't actually fire anyone, he had 2 resignations, and then Bork fired Cox the third go-around. So Cox was removed. Shortly thereafter, a new special counsel was appointed named Jaworski, Leon Jaworski. And basically, it just resumed whatever Cox was doing. And Jaworski sent the subpoena to Nixon. And at that point, Nixon realized he was toast. He couldn't fire one again. So instead, he challenged the subpoena. And he argued that the subpoena from Jaworski was unconstitutional. And this case is in your book. I don't assign it anymore because we don't have enough time. But it's called United States versus Nixon. Very important case, 1972 or 3, might be off on the year. 73, I think. And this is a question of whether an executive branch official could subpoena the president. Right? Again, this was not a subpoena that came from a third party. You know, for example, a criminal trial, right? Someone needs evidence from the president, and the defendant subpoenas the president. This was a subpoena from an executive branch official, whether it could proceed forward. And the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the subpoena was proper. Okay? I think maybe a week or 2 after that, Nixon resigned. Right? Once the court said, turn over the tapes for these documents, these recordings, Nixon was toast. He was over. And the president resigned, the first time a president ever resigned in American history. Okay. Why is all this relevant? The reason why this is relevant is this scandal, the Watergate scandal, resulted in the creation of the Ethics in Government Act. The Ethics in Government Act, which was enacted in the wake of the Saturday Night Massacre. And the purpose of the Ethics in Government Act was to ensure that this will never happen again, this Saturday Night Massacre, and allowed for the creation of an independent counsel office. An independent counsel that's not appointed by the president and that can't be removed directly by the president. Okay? And that's the statutory framework that gave rise to Morrison against Olson. Why did I just give you this? Oh my God, it's almost an hour. This is almost been a lecture for a long time. This is almost a 50-minute lecture on the history. You can't get Morrison v. Olson unless you understand the history going back to the decision of 89. So make sure you take good notes on this and maybe go back and watch it again. Now, why is this relevant to today? Right? Any of you read newspapers? They don't exist, but I suppose in theory. I'll cut to the chase. We no longer have an Ethics in Government Act. Right? It expired after the Clinton. Oh God, there's just so much to talk about. Did anyone watch the Kavanaugh interview today at 6? Oh, you were in class. I'm sorry. I was watching it. So Brett Kavanaugh worked in the Ken Starr investigation, right? Brett Kavanaugh was Ken Starr's deputy. And just history of sense of humor. He was the one who pushed Starr to ask all the questions that Clinton had, his various sexual escapades. There's a lot of irony here. It's just the universe has a sense of, I don't know what. I don't know, something. But after the Clinton investigation, almost everyone agreed that this is a bad idea. That having this sort of special counsel that can go investigate forever without any controls is a bad idea. And the Ethics in Government Act basically expired. It lapsed. It had to be renewed every couple years and just expired on its own terms. So why is all this relevant? We are basically back to what the law was when Nixon was president, where the appointment of the special counsel is done within the executive branch, with some tweaks. So, for example, the special counsel, Mueller, who's been on the job now for about 2 years, was appointed by Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. Not the Attorney General, because the Attorney General recused. There's ongoing litigation if Rosenstein had the power to appoint him, but I'll put that aside for now. The reason why this is relevant is that if Rosenstein indeed resigns or perhaps is fired, then the supervision of the Mueller investigation falls to the Solicitor General, not Robert Bork, but Noel Francisco, who's our Solicitor General now. So now you know everything that's going on in the world. Any questions? I just want like 45 minutes, sorry. It's like Felix Frankfurter. Funny story about Bork, though, when he was at the SG, he was basically acting Attorney General, but he refused to act as such. The AG gets a free car, right? Gets a limo to drive you around. And he refused to get that because he didn't want to like act like the Attorney General because he didn't think it was permanent. So he had this old Volvo, this beat-up old car with like 4 cylinders, and he couldn't get it up the ramp at the garage, but he would not take the agency limousine. Okay. All right, I think I gave you everything you need to know. All right, so questions on this history? Very important history.
You said the special counsel office is not the same as the executive.
The special counsel that exists today is pretty similar to what happened in Nixon. Not exactly, but it's pretty similar. In that there's no judicial appointment of the special counsel, and the only difference is that the regulations in effect now say that the special counsel can only be fired for good cause. I have questioned if those regulations are constitutional, but that doesn't matter, right? But the Nixon one didn't have that sort of standard. It was a slightly different standard. So there are some protections for the special counsel now, but they're not very strong. I don't think they're constitutional either, but it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what I think. How about I have to testify in an impeachment trial next year? I really don't want to testify. Anyway, go on. I don't want to. Okay, yeah, Elliot.
So is this law no longer in effect?
The special counsel, the independent counsel law at issue in Morrison expired.
Right, so then we don't have these regulations anymore?
Nope, no. The law expired, but you still have certain regulations that protect the special counsel from the executive branch. Those regs can be repealed by the executive branch in theory, I think. There's some debate about it as well, but it's not a statute. The entire process where the judges appoint, that doesn't exist anymore, thankfully. People have really short memories. Like, in the late 90s, everyone said, we got to get rid of this. And now it's like, let's bring it back. Bad idea. Bad idea. These things were a mistake. Ken Starr should never have done what he did. It was a bad idea. Okay. That brings us to Morrison against Olson. I called on one person? No, I called on Danny. You've been... No, who's next? Yaron. You've been on death row for an hour, haven't you? Just waiting to be called on. I'm sorry. That must be very traumatic. Yaron, can you please walk me through the facts in Morrison, just at a high level, and then we'll drill down, but just give me the high-level facts.
Okay, so we have the ethics and
Okay, good.
and basically we could appoint an independent counsel to investigate, and it's appropriate to prosecute certain high-ranking government officials for violations of federal criminal law.
Mm-hmm.
So the independent counsel could terminate after the investigation was complete.
Okay.
The attorney general was the only person who could actually fire the counsel.
Okay.
And the plaintiff in this case is actually Morrison, and she's the independent counsel.
Very good.
And she was appointed to investigate a possible obstruction of justice.
Obstruction. There's nothing new, my friends. There's absolutely nothing new. Go on.
Of Olson,
Yeah.
because he was giving misleading information to a congressional subcommittee.
Yeah, everything's obstruction.
And then basically the plaintiff asked, Morrison asked for certain documents, and then the defendant said that the EPA the Ethics and Government Act was basically unconstitutional.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, do you know who the origin of Morrison versus Olson was? I think they put this in the book. Gorsuch's mom.
Yeah.
By the way, you know where Gorsuch went to high school? Georgetown Prep. He was classmates with Kavanaugh. Wait for the other shoe to drop. Just wait. I'm waiting for it. It's gonna once Kavanaugh's done, they're gonna go after him as well. This is not gonna end anytime soon. They were classmates at Georgetown Prep. I haven't seen his yearbook though, or his calendar. Who kept calendars? Do people keep calendars? Is that a thing? Paper calendars? Is that a thing? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so Anne Burford Gorsuch was head of the EPA in the Reagan administration, and she did some screw-ups with the Superfund, which was like this massive waste dump thing, not important. And apparently Ted Olson, who was working in the Reagan Justice Department, gave some misleading advice. And whether he did or not doesn't really matter for our purposes, but the Democrats spent years trying to find something against him, and they finally made allegations, which triggered the appointment of an independent counsel. And the process by which the independent counsel goes forward is very intricate. Carrie, you want to walk me through the process of how a judge is, I'm sorry, damn it, good way. How the special independent counsel is appointed, please?
It's something to do with a judge, apparently.
I always think and say what I'm thinking, and it's really bad for class. I'm terrible. Well, Carrie, just give me a little bit, please.
I'm sorry, could you say one more question? I was so
Oh, you're
focused.
funny. You're funny.
I was so focused.
You're gonna try and trick me. How are the independent counsels appointed under the statute? Walk me through the process, please.
So, would it be that it could be submitted to?
How does it start, right? In other words, is the president involved in the appointment of independent counsel? So who's involved? How does it happen, Carrie?
So they go to the Congress, and then they,
Are you guessing?
I am.
No, that's not. No, that's all right. Danny?
Is it the Attorney General's application to the court?
Okay, so why, under what circumstance must the Attorney General make such an application?
After they've completed.
Well, specifically, on what triggers it? What triggers the Attorney General's duty to report? That's the important point.
He receives information.
Yeah, go on. You're right.
He receives information, and that upon receipt, he has to determine whether that is sufficient.
Very good.
Constitute grounds to investigate.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Danny. So the first step is if the AG receives information that he thinks is sufficient to constitute grounds to investigate. That's a very light standard, right? They investigate everything, right? So if the AG gets a report saying there are grounds to investigate, he has to conduct an investigation. Preliminary. Okay? 90 days later, what happens, Tricia?
He has to determine whether it is special counsel, and at that point, the AG and the Justice Department are required to suspend their investigation.
And what must they do? What has to happen after 90 days?
They have to make the determination of whether it moves forward or not, and they have to, the independent counsel has full authority to dismiss the matter.
Well, no, no independent counsel yet. But what happens if the AG decides there's no ground to investigate further? What must he do?
My understanding was that was it then.
No. Am I going the wrong way again?
Yeah, we are.
Oh, did I do you already? I'm sorry. I went. Do you want to do it again?
I know the answer.
Yeah, give me the answer.
They
I'm sorry.
reported to the special court.
Yeah, tell me about the special court, please.
Special court is there 3 judges?
Judges, yeah.
Um,
And then what does the AG have to tell them?
What their report found, like what their investigation turned up.
Very good. Okay. So after the AG's Attorney General, I'm sorry. After the Attorney General does a preliminary investigation, he's required to report to the special division. These are 3 judges who are appointed from the federal court in Washington, D.C. And basically at that point, he tells the judges, here's what I found. Now, if the Attorney General finds there is ground to investigate further, the Attorney General asks the court to appoint an independent counsel. Right, so that's the request from the AG. What if he says, nope, there's nothing more to investigate? The court can still appoint special counsel. Independent counsel. So in other words, the court has the power to appoint a special counsel regardless of what the AG wants to do. Even if the Attorney General says, let's stop it here, there's nothing to go further, The court can say, you know what, we disagree. We're going to appoint a special counsel, independent. I keep saying special and independent, and they're actually different. I have to be careful. Independent counsel is under this statute. The special counsel is what we have now, what happened with Nixon with just the regulations. So let me try to make terminology precise. Okay? So once the court decides to appoint an independent counsel, this person has the full power, the full and independent power to exercise all investigative and prosecutorial functions of the DOJ. They can convene grand juries, litigate, appeal, issue subpoenas. They can do everything. Now, Samantha, here comes the important... Oh, no, you were here this weekend, right? Yes. You get your pass. Elliot, so here's my question for you. Removal. How can independent counsel be removed from office?
Is that something that's in here?
I think so. Should be. Hope so. Important point. All right. What are the restraints on removing of the independent counsel?
This is through the act, right?
Yes, under the act. Can the Attorney General do it for whatever reason he wants?
No, is that the good cause part?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right.
No, not yet, so no, not for good cause.
So under the statute, the independent counsel can only be fired for good cause. And good cause means things like physical disability, mental neglect, or some other condition. It's got to be a good reason. It can't be, I'm firing you because you're getting too close to the goods, right? I'm firing because you're getting me in trouble. It can't be for whatever reason at all. Now, what if, Tim was here also, right? You're here. So Dusty, let me ask you a question. Yeah, it goes quick when people are here. Dusty, what happens then if the Attorney General fires him and the independent counsel doesn't agree that there was cause to fire? What happens then? Yeah, he says you're fired. He's like, nope, you can't fire me. What happens then? What can the independent counsel do?
I'm not sure. Can they appeal to the special division?
They challenge in court. That's right. It's not to the special division, but they can actually seek review in federal court about the termination. And that's an important point. With Nixon, once he fired people, that was it. They went home. Well, Nixon actually didn't fire anyone, but Nixon ordered Bork to fire Cox, and then once Cox was fired, he went home. But now, if Cox was fired, he can then seek judicial review of whether there was adequate cause to fire him. Everyone with me so far?
Wait, I'm getting confused over the now in the case. You just said now. Say that again, what you just said. Repeat what you just said.
With Nixon, when he ordered Bork to fire Cox, there was no judicial review of that termination. But with the independent counsel statute, if the AG fires the special counsel, they can seek judicial review.
Okay, all right.
Got it? Yeah. Yeah, that's why you have to compare and contrast the Nixon with the Morris versus Olson case. You know.
So is that the protection that is supposed to eliminate another possible Saturday?
Yes, sir.
Massacre?
Yeah, that the president wants to fire people, they have to go to a court and see if that's permissible. And in theory, the court could order reinstatement, although I have my doubts about that. Okay, but we're not done yet, right? So that's how it operates. The court appoints these independent counsels, and the Attorney General, not the President, right? It's not the President's power to remove. It's the Attorney General can remove with cause. Okay, everyone with me? Gerald, let me ask you this question. How can a judge appoint a prosecutor? How can that be right? How can a court appoint a special independent counsel? How is that possible?
So we talked a little bit on Article 2.
Okay, good. Let's read it. Show me where.
So it says, but the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such interior officers as they think proper in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments.
Okay. All right, good. So we have this clause, right? we have the Appointments Clause. And it says at the very end, Congress may by law, which means by statute, vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in heads of department. So, Gerald, in order for the Attorney General, in order for the independent counsel to fit in that last framework, what kind of officer do they have to be? Inferior, that's right. Congress cannot vest the appointment of a principal officer in the courts of law. They can only vest the appointment of an inferior officer in the courts of law. Back to our case. Ted Olson challenged Alexa Morrison's authority, and he basically said that you're unconstitutional. You are not constitutionally appointed. And he raised a couple arguments, right, Dan? So what are the arguments that Olson raised against the constitutionality of Alexa Morrison's appointment?
That she was not an inferior officer.
Okay.
And there was 3 questions. And then whether she could be removed by just cause.
Uh-huh.
And then the last one was if the act violated the separation of powers.
Thank you. I'll take each of those in turn. So let's start with the first one, right? If I forget the second one, remind me. I usually forget the second one, but I'll try and do each of them 3. So, Dan, let's talk about inferior versus principal, right? What does the court hold? Is Morrison a principal or an inferior officer?
They say that she's an inferior officer because she has limited jurisdiction and tenure and lacks policy-making authority.
Okay, so the majority says she's inferior. She's subject to removal by the Attorney General, although there are constraints to that removal. Her duties are limited. Okay? And her jurisdiction is fairly narrow. Now, the vote in this case was 7-1. Justice Kennedy was on the court at this point, but I think he had just been confirmed and he didn't vote in this case, so he didn't have a decision, so there were only 8 justices. But the vote here was 7-1. I'm sorry?
Is the Kennedy that Scalia cites in here, that extent?
Is it a Ninth Circuit case?
I don't know how we would
I can't remember. Maybe. Okay. Oh no, he cites Kennedy and Noel Canning.
Yeah.
No, that's in Noel Canning, not in Morrison. No, that is Kennedy. Yeah, I had to juxtapose. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So going back to Morrison, the vote was 7-1, but Justice Scalia wrote the lone dissent, and I'm a unashamed Scalia fan. This is probably his best written opinion of all time. It gets better every year I read it. In fact, Justice Kagan once said it gets better every year. And Justice Scalia makes points about the structure of the Constitution. And he would often give this speech on the lecture circuit. He gave hundreds of speeches throughout the years to law students. He loves speaking to law students. And he would always say when he writes a dissent, he doesn't write it for his colleagues because he didn't persuade them. He writes it for law students. That is, dissents will be in case books for generations to be read, and so they will. Exactly. And that's why he writes the way he writes. But he makes a point about structure. And in ConLaw, we have 2 concepts. You have structure and you have rights. The Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment. But Scalia says every republic in the world, has a Bill of Rights. And he would always cite the Soviet Union, which had this awesome constitutions. And you have the right to housing and the right to education, the right to food. That's great. People are starving to death, right? The parchment barriers, to quote the Federalist in the Constitution, right? These parchment barriers are what matter. I'm sorry, the parchment barriers, protection of the Bill of Rights, don't really get you much. What controls government power and protects freedom, Scalia says, is structure. And he views the entire notion of this independent counsel as conflicting with the structure of the Constitution. And he hits each of the 3 points Diana mentioned a minute ago. He says that Morrison is not an inferior officer, he's principal, that the restraint on the removal power is unconstitutional, and that the entire idea of the special counsel being appointed by the courts violates the separation of powers, that it blends the three. And one thing you'll notice is that the majority has no response to Scalia. They basically ignore him. And this was a common trend. You'll see this in Noel Canning, lots of different cases. Actually, Noel Canning Breyer acknowledges it briefly. This is one thing. We're not saying this, right? But it's very often the case where Scalia dissents, the majority just ignores him. And that's all well and good. But then you have a law school class 30 years later, and it's like, well, there's no response. I guess there wasn't a response. And that's the cost of ignoring a dissent. Justice Ginsburg always makes this point. She says whenever Scalia would write a dissent to his case, her majority opinion becomes stronger because she has to respond and engage the points, which other law students might point out. So the Scalia dissent is very powerful. But he argues that with respect to the first point, that she is principal, that she is able to do the entire breadth of Department of Justice's investigative powers. She can issue subpoenas, charge anyone she wants. She has very little supervision. And he argues because she's not inferior, her appointment by the courts is not proper. Why is this important? Is Mueller a principal or an inferior officer? This is an issue that's being actively litigated now. Now, under Morrison, I think the answer is somewhat straightforward. Mueller has far fewer powers than did Morrison, right? Mueller has a lot less authority than did Morrison. So I think the answer, if Morrison was inferior, then so is Mueller. I think Scalia was right, so I think the answer maybe comes out a different way. But to the extent there are still 5 votes for Morrison, Mueller is fine. By the way, I was at a lecture a couple of years ago with Brett Kavanaugh, and Kavanaugh said that one day he hopes Scalia's opinion becomes the majority. So that's out there. He's right. Okay, so that's the first question, right? Is she principal or inferior? Marcus, let's do the second one, right? How does the majority, and I guess the dissent, discuss the restriction on the removal power? Yeah, but the restraints that she can only be removed for cause and then there's review by the courts.
Preserving the concept of the separation of powers, they should be allowed to preserve their powers.
Well, Marcus, I mentioned this earlier, but what does the court say about Humphrey's executor and whether she's quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial? What does the court say about that?
Humphrey's executor?
Yeah, what does the court say about Humphrey's executor? What does the court say about the line, right? At what point can Congress restrict the president's removal power? Kristen?
They talked about how it's like a bright line, and that basically that there was no power given to the president in the Constitution, and then that should be what we rely on.
Kristen, let me ask the question a little differently. Is the court troubled by the for-cause protection of the special counsel, or the independent counsel?
In the majority?
Yeah, is the majority troubled by the for-cause protection? When I say for-cause, it means they can only fire them for a good reason.
No, not really, because the president's ability to
There it is.
execute his own constitution.
Good. Yeah, keep going. You're exactly right. Just keep going with that. Exactly right.
Basically, the presidency to control like the smaller offices is not really central to his main purpose. It's kind of like a delegation.
Exactly. They say, look, the president can still do his job. That this doesn't impose a significant enough constraint in the president's powers. Even though the restriction, the for-cause removal, restricts the president's power somewhat, it doesn't go far enough. So the new line, right? I think, Christy, you said the word control is one of the words used, right?
As far as the bright line?
Yeah.
The bright line will, the constitutional authority.
right? The statute does not deprive the president of exclusive control, right? The statute does not deprive the president of enough control over his executive branch. And the court makes a very big fuss about this, right? And because he has some control over his own administration, the statute's fine. Now, this is not a bright line, right? How much control is too much? How much restraint is too much? The court doesn't say. And Scalia absolutely pummels them on this point, right? He has this one good phrase. It's like referring to shackles as an effective means of locomotion, right? The fact that you're restraining the president's powers is saying it's helping him, engage his job a little bit better. So the test now concerns to how much control the statute imposes. We don't have a good resolution here. And since the statute expired, it's sort of an open question. But the Humphrey's executive line between quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative is out. It's how much control does this statute impose on the president's power? That's our test. Okay. Sergio, what about the third one? The separation of powers. What does the majority say about what is violates the separation of powers?
It doesn't violate
Okay.
the division of powers.
That's good. Why?
So it's talking about how, Congress can request the appointment of the...
Well, Sergio, let me ask the question a little differently. Generally, how does a criminal prosecution proceed? Generally, in the federal system. How does a federal criminal prosecution proceed in the federal system? Clay, you know? Oh, you're on for your beat. Janice? How does a federal criminal prosecution usually proceed? What are the steps?
Charges, if they evidence, and then
Who's responsible for decision to bring charges?
in the federal, you said federal, so the grand jury, they get a, I believe the grand jury decides that they should be charged.
Prosecutor. And which branch of government is a prosecutor in?
Oh, that would be under executive.
Yes, ma'am.
No, wait a minute.
So generally, she's right. So generally in our federal system, the decision to bring charges is decided by the executive branch. The decision to investigate is decided by the executive branch. The decision not to investigate further is decided by the executive branch. Scalia makes his point that the entire aspect of prosecution of crimes is a solely executive function. But the independent counsel statute blends it across the government. The decision to investigate begins not by the Attorney General's own idea, but on a referral of information from anyone, someone, it could be Congress. And the decision to appoint a special counsel is not based only on the Attorney General's idea, but based on a 3-judge panel. And the decision to fire the independent counsel is not only the Attorney General's, it's limited to special cause or good cause and subject to review in the courts. So Scalia says this turns our separation of powers on its head. Because instead of having a purely executive function like prosecution, it blends it across all 3 branches. In many countries, the prosecutions are actually part of the judiciary, right? The prosecutors work for the courts. It's a very different system. We don't have that here. So Scalia argues, I think, very passionately that this entire regime distorts the separation of powers. And giving judges this authority is a mistake, and we shouldn't have this.
Okay,
Go ahead, Jen.
Can I ask a question there?
Yeah.
Because he does talk about,
he raises the question of, is it unthinkable, if the president should have exclusive power, even when the election is by him, or is it? So he does
He
raise that
mentions by
question.
him, he does.
And, but I sort of got the feeling that the majority is sort of, the act sort of takes that into consideration. Whereas what Scalia was saying was that, well, that's the risk that we take with having, our Constitution as it is, with the separation of powers as they are.
Corruption
So,
go unchecked.
Exactly. But then there's no.
Is there? Well, Janice, let me ask you a question. What's the alternative to having an independent counsel if there's malfeasance going on? If the Congress finds that there's malfeasance, what's the alternative to a special counsel?
Right. So I think he talked about that. I think he I can't maybe completing the cases, but I think he talked about the political process playing out, so that the legislative body, checking.
Believe it or not, the FBI is not the only branch that can investigate stuff. Congress can investigate as well when they perform their advised consent function.
Right. Okay, but I think where I get what Scalia is saying, but it sort of departs a little bit because there's possibility that the system breaks down and you don't have the checks and balances that are necessary.
What do you mean it breaks down?
Well, there may not be a check on the president.
Why not?
I don't know, turn on TV and you can probably see it,
Okay, so let me, I was waiting for someone to make this point, so I'll do it now. So Janice raises, I think, a good point. We have a political party system, right? And if we have the president is of one party and Congress is of the same party, then there will not be oversight.
No.
Is that your point?
No, that's not what I'm saying. No, I'm saying that if it's possible that if you have an inept legislative body, then there may not be any
They not be able to check them.
Or there may be a choice not to check the president. Or the other part of that, which I saw in Scalia's writing was that, so what the executive branch have, and he said exclusive, that's the word he used, exclusive power, right? Mm-hmm. That if you have complete control over an investigation that is personal, then there's a lot that even the political process can't play out because you may not learn about those things until years later, if you ever learn about if you ever learn about it.
How long is the president?
About liberty, but that is an infringement on liberty.
How long is the president's term?
4 years.
And how long are members of the House term for?
2 years for the House, but that's.
Well, let me take this back. So in theory, right?
Oh, in theory. Okay, that's in theory, not in
theory, right? In theory, if you have an inept legislature, they can be thrown out every 2 years.
They could.
And now her question is, what if you keep re-electing inept legislators? Right. That's a reflection of our polity, and that's maybe quite sad. But because the president serves a term of only 4 years, maybe 8 years if he's re-elected under a current order, any malfeasance, the investigation, which almost always will extend beyond the president's term. The Kent Starr investigation extended almost the entirety of the Clinton administration. I think the current Mueller thing will probably extend for the entirety of the Trump administration. And after all this said and done, nothing really happens. But I want to take Janice's point. I think she's a fair point. Scalia is more troubled by the intrusion of the independent counsel than he's troubled by the risk of corruption itself. Yeah. And I think he's saying, it sucks that we have to tolerate certain acts of corruption in government in our system. But it's far worse to allow Alexa Morrison, for example, to run around and turn our government upside down. Right? I think that's basically, that's a trade-off he's making.
While the separation of powers may prevent us from righting every wrong, it does so in order to ensure that we do not lose liberty.
So say it louder, the last part you trail off.
He said, while the separation of powers may prevent us from righting every wrong, it does so in order to ensure that we do not lose liberty.
Yeah,
okay. Liberty structure was necessary to ensure liberty.
But this goes back to Janice's point, right? How can you have liberty with a corrupt government, right? How do you have...
With an unchecked
corrupt government.
Breaks down.
And these are, again, the very different conceptions between the majority and the dissent.
Doesn't Scalia think that the system will break down if you deviate from the structure?
Yeah, so Scalia, I like this debate, good. So Scalia would say that as long as you have the structural protections, that these governments can protect freedom. But I think Janice responds.
Yeah,
Go
that
ahead.
would be no, because I mean, if you look at the, not today, just go back to Watergate. Just go back to, it would not have, the system would not have worked itself. Well, maybe it would have, I don't know.
Well,
I wasn't alive, so I don't know, I don't remember.
Hold on, I don't know either. But Nixon didn't have an independent counsel, and he left office.
I was saying just take the, if things were different at that time, I'm just saying.
But after Nixon fired his entire cabinet, his administration was on a death slope, right? Once he did the Saturday Night Massacre, his days in office were numbered. So even if you get rid of the special protections of removal, if they actually exercise that power, that's a political cost that weakens a politician.
Yeah, but if you have, but what Scalia is arguing for is to go even further than that. And that's what I'm saying, go back to Nixon, not to where the law was then. I'm saying to what Scalia is saying it should be.
So Scalia actually worked in the Nixon administration, right? He was there at the time. They all were. You know. If you didn't have the special counsel, Nixon did not have independent counsel, right? Mm-hmm. There's a cost to firing people investigating you, isn't there?
Yes.
I mean, look.
There was a cost.
There's a huge cost because it means you're hiding up something, you're covering up something. And I think Scalia's point is, even if you have the Nixon regime without this independent act, the president still is not going to be able to skate away from this. That political pressure. Look, congressional committees have subpoena powers. You don't need the judiciary. The Congress can subpoena stuff. You can have an impeachment proceeding as well. We have an impeachment proceeding. Nixon was going to get impeached if he didn't resign. He was going to get impeached and probably would have been removed also, I think. So you don't need to have this independent agency when you have congressional investigation, which is built into the Constitution.
If it works, if the system works.
It has to work. Do you think the independent counsel works?
Well, I think that, I mean, if because you can't deny what's going on today, so you really can't separate that. If it works, then I would have absolutely agreed with Steve.
Well, let me ask you, Janice. Let's just make it a little current. If the House flips to Democrat in about 20-something days,
then it may work.
Then it's going to work like a charm. They're going to subpoena the yeah. No, I can make.
Definitely would have the checks and balances.
But that's the point, though. If in 20
and it should not depend on. It should not depend on political affiliation, because that is not what Scalia was talking about. He was talking about structure. Period.
But so let me go back to the point before. If we have a complacent legislature now, and they get thrown out of office in 20-something days, in the next 2 years, basically nothing but impeachment hearings and subpoenas and trials, then there's oversight. You don't need this other stuff as much.
That's what I said. If it works, that's what if it works, I agree with him wholeheartedly. If it works, but I do see the caution on the other side.
Oh, good point. Anyone else? I like having little dialogues. It's like you know the little thing. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then Sam.
If it doesn't work, then that's the Constitution failing. That's a bigger issue.
Or it's the electorate.
Because you're not saying that. Like, it's not a question of whether this is unconstitutional. You're saying that the Constitution is failing, because the Constitution was set up that way. The Constitution, what Scalia is saying is that the Constitution wasn't set up to support this act. So you're saying that if the system fails, if the Constitution fails,
No, I know what I'm saying. I know what I'm saying. I know what I'm saying. I'm saying that in order for it to really work, and because I think what he's saying is a really idealistic way, and that's the way it should be. But the reality, I mean, is this is the Constitution we're writing. I mean, this is. It's
the Constitution we're expounding. Yeah.
Yes, and so.
Oh, Selena didn't like that one.
It changed.
Oh, now you're talking Selena.
So times change and things happen.
You know what Scalia would say? The Constitution's dead. Dead.
Well, he actually did.
He says it all the time. It's dead. It's dead. I saw a hand here. Was it Sam?
Yeah.
Please.
Is he concerned that by letting the special counsel have the power that he's taking the voice away from the people? Because
yeah. Who elected this person? The person wasn't elected. They can't be removed.
By the people, then there's an election every 2 years. Yeah. People can voice their concern.
Yeah, if there's an election every 2 years and the current Congress is complacent, or not doing their job, to use Janice's words, then put someone else in office who will subpoena the hell of the president and impeach him, right? The idea of the staggered terms, President 4, Congress 2, was not an accident, right? You're never more than 2 years away from a midterm election where you can put different people in office who can totally change the second half of a presidency. It happens every 2 years. And, you know, if any election goes a couple weeks, I'm sure we'll see a lot of this. And you can always impeach. All right. What else on Morrison? Again, very important case. You know, there was a time before the election of 2016 where I would say in class that Scalia was right, and people would get very upset at me. Yeah, Scalia makes sense. But I think people are now perhaps moving away from Scalia, and they're saying, yeah, Rehnquist is right. But there was a long time when I would teach the case, yeah, Scalia was right, and no one would really object when I say that. Now it's it is. Every year I teach this not this particular topic, but this class, things go different ways every year. Things are never the same. By the way, I learn more from you than you will ever know. I learn a lot from you. I always learn stuff, which I'm grateful. That's why I do let you talk so much. I'm learning too. Yeah, Mia.
Is Scalia's argument kind of like Jackson's argument in this weekend's reading?
The Steel Seizure case? Or Korematsu?
Korematsu,
Yeah.
where he's saying, you know, you can't deviate, like, you give an inch and...
Oh, the loaded gun line? That where Jackson said it's like a loaded gun lying around?
I mean, because he said, like, it's where it's clear what the Constitution says, you know.
Well, he makes his point to Noel Canning. Maybe I'll transition. He makes his point to Noel Canning a lot more forcefully. In Noel Canning, he explains. Yeah, he's very upset. In Noel Canning, he explains that in the battle between Congress and the executive, the president will always win because there are 500 members of Congress and there's one president. And the president will always have the ability to energize and mobilize in ways that the legislative branch cannot. But he also makes a point at the end of his opinion, and I'm going to paraphrase, I don't have it in front of me, where he says, the court doesn't always get a chance to hear these separation of powers cases. They very rarely come to the court because usually resolved in a political process. But when they do, the court shouldn't stand back and give the president this extra power. Because when you give a president, you know, an inch, to use Mia's words, it can be used in a very different context. And let me just give you an actual real-world example. This is real. But let me give you an example. This is actually a real-world example. I'm going to jump ahead. The holding in Noel Canning is 3 days is too short, 10 days is probably okay. We don't have at the middle, right? Goldilocks, right? Justice Breyer, God love him, right? 3 days is too short, 10 days is, you know, just right. You know, 10 is good. What happens to 4 through 6, 4 through 7, 4 through 9? We don't really know. When Justice Scalia died, he died during the recess of the Senate. Now, most people were freaking out. First thing I did was I checked my Senate calendar. I'm like, holy crap, that had like a 9-day recess coming up. And I had this, I don't think I was the first, but I was probably one of the first people like, holy crap, President Obama can make a recess appointment. Funny, yeah. So I actually, you know, I wrote about this in my book by mates I was working for in the campaigns at the time, guy who lost, and I made a call and said, you need to get back in session immediately. And they actually had a negotiation between the White House and the president saying, we need you to promise us you're not going to make an appointment this week and also coming on Monday morning. We're just going to come into session to break up the 3-day break. But the Breyer opinion, which left this issue open, created this potential clash between the branches. Right? If Breyer just said 10 days is your limit, okay, then we know what the answer is. But by leaving it this 3 to 10, whatever this, you know, this range is, you had an actual conflict between the branches where the legislative branch told the president, you might make one, we don't know, but tell us what you're going to do. So there's a problem when you have these sort of functional decisions that don't give you the clear, bright line rules, because some other conflict will arise that isn't clearly governed by the old case, and it creates a controversy. Because what if President Obama had appointed Merrick Garland on day number 7 of the recess, and it was challenged? Is that constitutional or not? I don't know. There's nothing in Noel Canning that tells me that answer. Garland would have to recuse because he's the person appointed. How would that even happen? Scalia's dead. That's like what, 8 justices, you tie? I mean, so it's Scalia's point is you need to have bright line rules to these separation of powers cases because it creates these sort of conflicts, right? Happens. Yeah, but I had there was like a good hour where I was like, oh boy. Yeah, Scalia dies February 13th, 2016, about 2 years ago. Okay. All right, any other questions on Morrison against Olson? Very important case. Okay, nothing on Morrison? Okay, let's do Noel Canning then. By the way, Noel Canning is not Noel Canning. It's not a person's name, Noel. Oh, like you. Yeah, it's. I've never heard of Noel before as a student. Our Solicitor General is named Noel Francisco. So I've never.
This is expired, right?
I'm sorry?
This is
Expired?
expired. The act.
The Ethics and Government Act. Yeah, it expired. It's no longer good law. People want to reenact it. I think it'd be a terrible idea. But people want to reenact it. So we go to Noel Canning, okay? Who am I up to? Noel, are you next?
No, he was here.
Oh, you were here. You have your freebie. Mia, are you next? Okay, you're freebie today. Earn it, my friend. All right, Mia, you want to give me the facts, please, on Noel Canning?
Sure. The National Labor Relations Board, which is an independent agency.
So they say.
Enforces federal labor law. So I recall that it was a Pepsi-Cola collective bargaining agreement.
Well, Noel Canning, they were a bottling company. They bottle for Pepsi.
Like
how does soda get in a can? They bottle stuff.
And so there's a collective bargaining agreement between them and labor, obviously, and they didn't enforce it. And so then the NLRB imposed penalties on them for not doing it. And on appeal, they got really clever. And they said that NLRB did not have the authority because they didn't have a quorum. Because which required, the quorum was 3 legitimate members of the 5-member panel. And the process to which they were able to claim that was 2 of the NLRB appointments had been basically, I guess, like sitting in for a year, whatever. They weren't getting through Congress. And so he had appointed them while Congress was in session, and they tabled them, and were ignoring them. And then the Senate recessed during formal session, and they had these 3-day pro forma sessions, and during which business was rarely conducted. And after they gavelled out one of those sessions, so on one of those 3-day recesses, a 3rd vacancy opened up, or it expired, and right after one of the pro forma sessions. So their NLRB no longer had a quorum, and Obama appointed all 3.
Good. Okay, very good. Thank you for that. So this is another case of political hardball. We've had fights over nominations. This is nothing new, right? We've had fights over nominations since the 1790s. This is nothing new. During the Bush administration, the Democrats began to use what's called the filibuster to block appointments to the National Labor Relations Board to prevent Bush's conservative nominees from making policy. After the election, it flipped. Now Republicans in Congress were using the filibuster to block President Obama's nominees to the board who would make liberal labor policy. No, there's nothing new. It's all politics. At one point, though, the quorum was about to drop down to 2 people. And if they only have 2, they can't engage in business. They can't do stuff. So President Obama looked at the calendar. He said, okay, the Senate has these pro forma sessions every 3 days, okay, where they come in. I saw the video, I think I showed you. They gavel in, they gavel out. It takes 30 seconds. They don't actually do anything. And President Obama said, look, these sessions, these 2-minute sessions, they're not really sessions. They don't count. So really the Senate's been in session for recess for like a couple weeks. And then so on this break, on the 4th of January of 2012, President Obama made several recess appointments. Well, actually, recess appointments. Noel Canning challenged them, saying that you can't issue judgment against us because you are not properly constituted. So the question here turns on the recess appointments clause. It provides the president shall have power to fill up vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate. What? Well, I number them, so you see now which one I'm talking about, right? That vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate. So the vote in Noel Canning was unanimous, 9-0. The court ruled that President Obama's recess appointments were unconstitutional. But it was basically a 5-4 case, right? The Obama position was actually really quite radical for the time, tame by today's standards. But at the time, it was a pretty big deal that you would basically treat the Senate not in session, even though they say they're in session. So people understood that he was going to lose. But it split 5-4 on the harder question, right? So let's take it one word at a time. The. Okay? So there are two types of recesses that are known. There's intra-session recess, and there's inter-session recess. Intra-session recess and inter-session recess. Quinn, what's the difference between intra-session recess and inter-session recess?
The inter-sessions were like Christmas and in between the 1 year thing.
Quinn, what's an intersection recess? You know what inter and intra mean, the suffixes? Which is which? Very good. So what's an intra-session recess?
Within session.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah. Intra-session recess means within a session. Inter-session is between the sessions. So intra-session means if you break for lunch for an hour, right? If you break for lunch for an hour, that's an intra-session recess. If you go home for the weekend, that's an intra-session recess. If you go home for Christmas, intra-session recess. There are lots of intra-session recesses, lots of them. Inter-session recess is something very different. Inter means, still recording, good. Inter-session recess means between the sessions. So generally, I mentioned this earlier, Congress meets for 2 years at a time, right? Every 2 years they have a congressional election, and they meet. So between 2016 and 2017, 2018 was the first session. You had a break. And between 2017 and 18, the second session. Now, historically, that break was long, to be a couple months. But say the break is maybe a couple seconds, right? They basically gavel out the first session, and they gavel in the second session. Okay? So there's only one inter-session recess between the two sessions, but there are a lot of intra-session recesses. So Vincent, according to the majority, when can the president make a recess appointment? During both of these, or just intersession?
So they decide that they can, that the president can do that during both.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did Scalia say? And again, it's a concurrence by Scalia, but it's basically a dissent. It is. And in fact, if you ever notice from the videos, I give you the audio of Scalia talking. That's from what's called the opinion announcement. They usually announce their opinions. It's always the majority they announce it from the bench. And sometimes a dissent is announced from the bench if it's very, very big deal. Very rare, a couple times a year. Scalia announced concurring opinion from the bench. I don't know if it's ever been done before, but he was really pissed about this case. He really was upset. So, Vincent, what does Scalia say about the recess of the Senate?
So
the with some emphasis.
He kind of attacks their argument regarding the historical practice.
Well, let's just start with the text, Vincent, right? If I say the recess, how many recesses am I talking about? The.
So Scalia would say that they're talking about the intersession.
If I say
recess.
the book, how many books are there?
That this is one. That's the one.
So the word the is what's called a definite article, if you want to be grammar, right? The means one. And so what does it say that one recess is?
The intersession recess.
Okay, very good. So Scalia is always a textualist. It says the recess means only one. If Scalia is correct, is your throat still not feeling so good? Okay, she emailed me. Okay, so mine. Oh, you were here too this weekend, weren't you? You were in here. Name tag? No, here.
Oh, me?
Yeah, what's your name?
Lund.
Lund, do you have your name tag? Just, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Lund, thank you. So what does Justice Scalia say about practice, right? Or let me ask the question differently. Have presidents made appointments during intra-session recesses in the past? Have presidents in the past made appointments during intra-session recesses?
No?
That's not correct.
Yes.
What does Justice Breyer discuss with respect to intra-session recesses? Yes, okay? Do you have it? Are these your notes? Delbert? Have presidents in the past made appointments during intra-session recesses?
Yes.
They have. Why is that relevant to Justice Breyer?
Because he's basing his opinion on history.
And which opinion does this remind you of from Youngstown? Which justice in Youngstown said we need to look to executive practice to figure out? Frankfurter. What word do you use? What's that word? Sleep on your lips. No. Who said it? Someone said it. Gloss. I put it in your lips. Come on, that's a good hint, right? Frankfurter explained in Youngstown, he's comparing opinion, that practice puts a gloss on history. That is, when the executive does something, fist bump, I say that when the executive does something and Congress doesn't seem to object, that actually changes the way we understand the Constitution. Now, Justice Breyer, to understand him, he worked for many years as legislative counsel for Senator Ted Kennedy. He lives and breathes Congress. He loves Congress. He wants Congress to function better. That's like his entire essence of life. And he says if the president makes these recess appointments during a session and Congress doesn't object, that's good enough for me. Now, just take a step back. What if the president does it and just Congress can't get their act together? To use Janice's word before, they're complacent, right? The president does it. Some people object and some don't. Does that mean the Constitution's meaning changes? Now, Scalia looks at it differently, right? Sorry, name tag? Drew. What does Scalia think about the history about appointments made during intra-session breaks?
He brought up a point where he thought that showed that there weren't that many appointments made during the intra-session break.
Right. So again, if Congress is in session, Drew, why does the president need to make a recess appointment? What else can the president do if Congress is basically in town? If Congress is in town, why does the president have to make an intra-session appointment? What can he do as an alternative?
I mean, if they were in town.
Yeah, but they went away for the weekend, but they're in session. What can the president do?
He can.
Say it.
He can make an appointment. I mean, he'd have to go to this Congress.
Yeah, the old-fashioned way, right? If Congress is in town, they just went away for lunch or something, they have an inter-session break, the president makes a normal nomination, and the Senate can confirm them in real time, right? If there's an urgency, right, the Senate can confirm quickly. So Scalia says, if they're in session, there's no reason to a recess appointment. And the reason why President Obama did these was not because Congress was absent, it's because they were blocking his guys, right? They were blocking his preferred nominees. This wasn't a case where the Senate was unable to vote. This was a case where they just didn't want to vote for the guy. So Scalia says, textually, the recess means one recess, and if Congress is in town, then the president can make a normal appointment and seek congressional consent.
So what are they supposed to do? Like, nobody wants his guys.
Well, you make a deal. You make a deal. And in fact, this is an important point, the people that President Obama nominated were eventually confirmed. They made a deal. In other words, they threw in some judges. They worked out a deal. Deals usually do work out. At least they used to. Maybe I don't know if they still do. All right, so that's the. Number 2. Vacancies that may happen. Ross, what's that phrase mean, vacancies that may happen? What's the debate between Scalia and Breyer on that one?
Whether it happened during the session.
What's it? What happened?
When they exist.
What's it or they? Identify your pronoun. What has to exist?
The recess.
Not the recess, no.
Or the session.
No. What does vacancies that may happen? What are they referring to? What's a vacancy, Russ?
Like an opening?
How does an opening occur usually?
Somebody leaves.
Someone dies. Someone's fired. Someone quits, right? Mm-hmm. So, under Justice Scalia's approach, how would you read vacancies that may happen? When does a vacancy have to happen?
You said they have to happen before.
Before what? What word? Vacancies that may happen blank. What word does it say? On the screen. Vacancies that may happen blank. During what?
The recess.
Of?
The Senate.
So according to Scalia, when does a vacancy have to arise?
Before.
Not before. What? You just said the word.
During.
Thank you. So explain. So when does a vacancy have to arise?
During the recess of the Senate.
And according to Scalia, how many recesses are there?
One.
Just one. So Scalia would say you can only use the recess power in a very limited circumstance. When a person leaves office in the break between the 2 sessions of Congress. Right? So someone, let's just say Congress recesses on January 1st for the end of the session. Guy dies on January 2nd. Only if he dies during the recess can the vacancy be filled. Right? Now, Jesse, Justice Breyer doesn't like that one very much. So, your name tag fell.
Jessica, but
I was close. You're okay, Jessica. So how does Justice Breyer then read the second one, vacancies that may happen?
I read that they could happen like both inter and intra.
Why? Does Justice Breyer allow? What if a vacancy happens the day before they break? So the session ends on January 1st, but the guy dies December 31st. Will Breyer still let that vacancy be filled?
Yeah.
Okay, why?
I wrote that he tried to resolve the ambiguity.
Okay.
Well, I just wrote that he was trying to resolve it. He said that term was
Ambiguous. That may happen, right? So Breyer would let them fill anywhere. And so Jessica, what does Scalia say? When does the vacancy have to happen?
So Scalia said that has to happen during.
During. Okay. So this is a big debate between Scalia and Breyer. And God rest his soul, but they would always have debates in the past. Right? Breyer is what you call a functionalist. He wants government to act efficiently. He wants it to be effective. That if someone leaves office and then Congress goes into vacancy, then the president can fill it. Scalia doesn't care about efficiency. He makes his very point. He says that gridlock is a feature and not a bug of our Constitution. It's a feature, not a bug. So for Scalia, this is meant to be an emergency provision. Only in a very rare circumstance can the president make a recess appointment. In the normal course, the president has to go the old-fashioned way and seek congressional consent. Raising your hand?
Oh, I just had a question
Please.
about the way Breyer said it, because he was kind of saying that we don't agree with this, but he said it doesn't naturally favor our broader interpretation, but saying that you just fill the vacancy when it happens, that's about as broad as you can get it, right?
Well, not fill it. The vacancy may happen.
Okay.
It's not that you can fill it, but the vacancy may happen. Now, if it said the vacancy may arise during the Senate, right? Mm-hmm. That would be a little bit clearer. So he says it's a little ambiguous. Scalia says no ambiguity at all. Okay, let me finish up the third one right away, and I'll run through it myself. We're running short on time. The third one is recess of the Senate. How long must a break be in order to trigger the recess power. On this one, I think everyone will agree Breyer's opinion is not very helpful. He says 3 is too short, 10 is good. We won't really say what happens in between that unless there's some emergency, then maybe we will have something shorter. And I can tell you from experience, if you're a constitutional lawyer and you're dealing with an actual live issue, it's not helpful. So where did he get 3 days from? Here, Article 1, Section 5 says neither house during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days. What does that mean? The House can't adjourn without the Senate's permission more than 3 days. Both houses have to agree to adjourn for the summer, right? That's why this controversy arose. The House was controlled by Republicans and the Senate was controlled by Democrats. And the Republicans would not let the Senate recess, which would allow Obama to put his people on the NLRB. So the Republican House kept the Democratic Senate in session. So that's where the 3 day comes from. Where does 10 days come from? I don't really know. Breyer, he did what he did. Scalia says the fact that the framers didn't give you a number is proof they were talking about the single break between the recesses. There's no doubt it could be as long as Congress wants, but Congress sets it. All right. But the bottom line is, the court held here that Congress is in session when they say they're in session. These pro forma sessions, even though they're only doing business for 5 seconds, that counts, and 3 days is too short. But more important than you understanding 3 days, 10 days, get the Scalia versus the Breyer debate into your head, because this is very important. The Breyer approach, which was the majority, was very functional, had to help government operate more efficiently, and the Scalia one, which had 4 votes. I mean, Justice Kennedy's not here anymore. It's possible that these 5-4 cases are going the other way. And it makes government much more rigid and inflexible. But the dissent was willing to basically say that these appointments were invalid, but also potentially thousands of other appointments in the past were also invalid. Right? Breyer puts a lot of weight and experience in how things have been done. Scalia says they were all wrong, we know better.
He doesn't address this clause. He doesn't address the 3 days.
He may in the part cut out of your opinion.
I'm sorry.
We edit your case book.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's in the part edited out. I used to sign this every year. I sign a complete opinion. And I used to sign this one, the complete opinion. It was 90 pages, so you don't have to read anymore.
Thank you.
Well, you're going to read Trump against Hawaii, which is not quite that length, but it used to be a burger file. I always try to give you one full opinion a year. All right. So questions on Noel Canning. All right. So let me try to synthesize Morrison versus Olson, Noel Canning. Generally speaking, the court is not like Scalia. Generally speaking, the court approaches things with a more flexible outlook. So in the Morrison versus Olson case, they upheld the independent counsel statute to give Congress the ability to root out corruption within the executive branch, as it were. And in Noel Canning, the court also ruled against President Obama, but they said, well, what you did was wrong, but do what everyone else does and just wait for a 10-day break and you can make your appointments. They didn't take the Scalia approach, which would have basically rendered the recess clause a dead letter. At that point, you'll never have another recess appointment again. We may not ever have one. I'm not sure. We may not have one for a very long time. I don't think we'll have one. I'm trying to think of a circumstance, but I think we're done with recess appointments. Anyway. Oh, but one last point. It could come up with the ultimate trump card. This is how it would actually work. The president has the power to adjourn Congress when they can't agree. So I think the president could just adjourn Congress and make a recess appointment immediately. I'm waiting. Someone's going to do it eventually. Scalia references this, right? The president can adjourn Congress, which creates a recess, and just make his appointment then. Adjourn. Adjourn means you tell him, go home. You're done.
Yeah, but then why didn't Obama do that instead of the performance section?
That would have been even more radical. The adjournment, the president's never adjourned Congress. It's never been done before. The president summoned Congress, say, come on, we need you for an emergency session. The president's never adjourned Congress and you guys go home. So that'll be your final exam next year, right? Great stuff. All right, anything else? All right, have a good night, everyone. I'll see you all on Wednesday. Thank you. And we're shifting 14th Amendment on Wednesday, right? We're doing Dred Scott thing? Yeah, so we're shifting course to Dred Scott. So just make sure you guys are ready for that. Yeah, coming up?